Hey everyone, and welcome back to Time with Tim. I'm Andy Carlson, joined by Tim Fletcher, and today we're sitting down with Dr. Todd Berntson. Dr. Todd is a Minnesota-based therapist, author, and speaker whose work centers on trauma, emotional attachment, and relationships. Through both personal experience and decades of clinical work, he's come to understand how emotional trauma quietly shapes the way we feel, see ourselves, and connect with others, and how with the right tools and support, those patterns can be transformed. His approach is grounded, compassionate, and deeply practical, helping people calm the body, reclaim their sense of self, and reconnect to life and love. Dr. Todd, we're so grateful to have you here today.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here.
We really enjoy letting our listeners get a sense of kind of what makes the who, what makes the person. And so we'd love to just get a sense of your own childhood and your background story before you moved into this life and into this world.
I think like a lot of people who have emotional trauma from childhood, I didn't really even recognize as a kid that I was wounded, right? All I knew is that there was something about me that just seemed different. When I was in a group of people, I always felt like there was some kind of invisible wall that was somehow keeping me from having that sense of belonging, that sense of connection that other people seem to share. And just the ability to do small talk and all of those kinds of things and just relate to each other just seemed awkward for me. And I never really understood why. And I really struggled in school. I remember when I was in sixth grade, I was put through this whole battery of tests to find out if I had learning disabilities or what the deal was. And it turned out that I was like at the college level in all of these, in all these different dimensions academically, when I was in sixth grade. And everyone was like, why can't you just buckle down and do well? And despite my best efforts, it's like my brain was just constantly racing and I just had a really difficult time sitting still. I was really unable to focus. I couldn't read. There just seemed to be something about me that was just off. It was just not like what I perceived in other people. And I remember when I was about 12 years old, maybe 13 years old, when I first discovered alcohol and drugs. And I can remember I was walking through this park one day. There were some woods that were across the street from our house. And I was walking through the woods and I came across this dilapidated 12-pack of Miller Lite that had been sitting in the sun so long that the tops of the cans were bleached white. And I remember picking up one of these cans and popping it open and drinking it. And it's hard to describe how disgusting the taste was. But I slammed 3 of them. And all of a sudden, it was like I felt something shift in me. It was like someone had grabbed me by the ankles and just shook my body and everything popped into place. And I felt a sense of like wholeness. I felt a sense of calm. I was like, so this is what it feels like to be normal, right? And from that point, I never wanted to leave that place. And so from a very young age, I got involved in alcohol and drugs. And back in the day, the only thing that was really available was like marijuana. And if you could find a dude to go buy some beer, from the store for you and pay him in the parking lot and things like that. And, some LSD, a few things like that. And so I would say that by the time I was 15 or 16 years old, I was pretty much a daily drug user and ended up running away from home at 17 and ended up in a treatment center in Minnesota, Hazelden, was there at a halfway house for about a year, went back home to Columbus, Ohio after that. Even though I'd been sober for at that point, for almost a year, I was just profoundly depressed. And it's hard to put into words for people who have never experienced just that profound, deep sense of just like disconnection from the world. And just this sense of just feeling just horrible about yourself and just feeling like there's this hole and this emptiness and just this vacuum that just paints the entire world with a shade of gray and just depletes you of any sense of joy or happiness, even in things that should. And so I ended up going back to primarily using marijuana and alcohol. And by the time I was 19, I was living in an abandoned house with a bunch of other addicts. At that point, it was like Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin were kind of my heroes because they used until the very end, right? I mean, they stuck in there until they died, kind of thing. And that was really my mindset. I'm like, I simply cannot imagine a life that didn't involve drugs and alcohol, because for me, it was so abjectly horrifying, just emotionally. And alcohol and drugs were the only things that gave me a sense of peace, a sense that there was somewhere I fit in, a sense of just kind of like calm. I was funny and people seemed to like me. Of course, I was, oftentimes giving them drugs and I was high myself. And so there was this kind of sense of I didn't fear people. I didn't feel so alienated, and unfortunately I was probably months away from death. I mean, I'm 6'2". I was down to 134 pounds. I mean, I was so malnourished that, I mean, my eyes couldn't adjust to changes in the difference in light levels in rooms. I mean, I would go from a dimly lit room to a bright room, and it would take me about 15 minutes for my eyes to adjust. I could, I was functionally illiterate. I mean, I was just, I was I was just a complete mess. But I just didn't feel like any other option was available to me. And then I had a pretty interesting experience on about 2:30 in the morning on September 10th of 1983, and I was standing in the kitchen of the abandoned house, of this abandoned house, and it was actually one of these old it was like one of these old brick mansions that at one point had like a servant's quarters and a horse stable and all of this kind of stuff, but had been long abandoned. We heated it by tipping over a barrel in the living room and throwing chunks of wood in there to burn, just to kind of get some heat. Yeah, I was standing in the kitchen of this abandoned house, and all of a sudden I felt myself just freeze in place, and I was surrounded by just kind of a pale yellow light that just seemed to vibrate. And everything in the room just looked different, as though it had like expanded in all directions and it just looked different. And I heard a voice say, "You don't have to live like this anymore." And then the light went away and I was standing there just going, the hell was that? Because I mean, I had acid flashbacks before, right? But that wasn't it. I could tell that that wasn't it. And I've been clean and sober ever since. And, a lot of people, when they talk about getting clean and sober, talk about how, oh, now my life was happy, joyous, and free. Things just started going so well. And it was like, not me, man. I mean, now it's like the only thing that gave my soul some kind of coherence was gone. And now it's like all of these demons and all of this stuff that had driven me into addiction to begin with, I was feeling in every nerve of my body. And it was just intense. And I felt confused and I felt sad. And then I would feel elated. And then I would feel alone. And it was just like my emotions were just an absolute mess. And I can remember one time, I was probably, I don't know, 5 months, 6 months sober or something like that. And I was sitting down by the river, and there was a road that went along down by the river. And I was just sitting there, and it was probably 1 in the morning, and I was just watching the cars go by. And I felt like I was sitting alone in a dark theater, just watching the world out here. And, as the cars go by, it was like I was watching them on a video screen, and I was in the audience, just completely separated from the world. And I think that really describes so much of what my first few years of recovery were like. I learned how to approximate like normal behavior, right? By watching other people and going, what are they doing that seems to work there? Because people seem to like them. Maybe if I act like that, then people will like me. But it never quite seemed to work because I think it wasn't authentic, right? I was putting on a performance, and I would kind of like shed the crocodile tears when it seemed like other people were crying, and kind of laugh when other people were laughing, but not really having an intuitive sense of like being engaged and being present in all of that. And it was, I mean, the decided to go to college and to try to do something. I had no idea what I was going to do. Kind of wanted to go somewhere in the field of mental health or psychology or sociology or something like that, because I found like human behavior interesting, and being early in recovery, a couple of 3-4 years in recovery, I had done some work in the 12 steps, and so there I had some interest in that. And so um I started taking some classes, and it was a real challenge. I mean, I had to take intermediate algebra 4 times before I actually passed it because I was just academically so unprepared. But in the first semester of going to a community college, I happened to be walking down the hallway one day, and I saw this poster on the wall. But there's this organization called the Sexual Violence Center of Minneapolis that was looking for volunteers. And I was like, that might be interesting, right? That might be a way to kind of get a little experience and get my foot in the door, be around other people that are in kind of the therapy piece of things. And so I gave them a call, and it was an interesting experience in a lot of ways. First of all, I was the only dude. And so when I walked into the training, it's like the whole room went silent and they all looked at me. And of course, it certainly triggered some like, oh my God, I'm in the wrong place. I'm totally not here. But the person who is running the sessions, was very much like, we're really glad you're here. Thank you. It's great to have, to have men, interested in this whole thing. And so I was going through the training, found it all very, very interesting, was learning a lot. And then there was this lecture during one of the classes where this guy came in, and he was talking about men who had been sexually abused as boys. And at the time, I remember thinking, like, oh, okay, I didn't realize that was a thing, but this will be interesting. And as he was going through his presentation, there was just a part of me that just sunk, because it was like everything that he described. It was as though he had just ripped my heart open and was just reading my insides, right? I mean, I was like, my God. And then it was like, did something happen to me? And is that why I'm so crazy, right? Is that why I always feel like I need to run? Is this why I have trouble concentrating? Is this why I can't go to the bathroom in a public restroom if anyone else is in there? Is this why, is this why I have addiction? Is this why all of these things are happening? And so, I sat with that a bit and started to explore that. I went to go see a couple of therapists, and honestly, I don't know that, back in the early 90s, that our understanding of trauma was really all that good, because it was very much a cognitive behavioral approach, kind of like, well, let's just challenge your self-defeating thoughts. And it's kind of like, yeah, I could, but that doesn't really seem to be changing anything, right? I mean, it's like there's this constant barrage of just stuff, but it's not just negative thoughts. There's like this feeling of being rudderless, this feeling of not understanding who I am. There are all of these other dimensions that go far deeper than just, am I telling myself that I'm not good enough for this job, right? That I need to challenge in order to apply for it. Went way, way deeper than that. And one day, I started thinking about a school that I'd attended when I was very, very young. Some flashback memories started coming to me. and which were just they were really bizarre. And I called my mom one time and I asked her about whether something had happened to me at this school. And I could tell that she knew something that she didn't want to share, because all of a sudden she started clearing her throat, and I could tell that she was like choosing her words very carefully. She was like, why? And, I would tell her about some of these memories, and what I eventually got out of her was that I shook and screamed so bad one day when she tried to drop me off that she couldn't bring me in, and she just brought me back home. And I understand too that there wasn't as much awareness about trauma back then as today. But I think about, like, if I was a parent and I saw my child reacting that way, I would be like, what's going on here? Right? What's happening at this school where they are so freaked out that I can't even, I mean, I was just crying and shaking hysterically. But that wasn't what happened. And, I don't know that I will ever fully know what happened at the school. And honestly, I don't know that it really matters all of that much. I think that there's a part of me that, if I could go, yeah, this happened. See, that's why, I'm so crazy, right? I mean, this is why I struggle with all of this stuff. But the reality is that I have all the stuff from emotional trauma. I mean, I am probably the quintessential dude who seems to carry all of these effects of childhood emotional trauma. And so whether it was that or, my dad ditching me in an elevator when I was 3, or whether it was when, I was being swung around while an attack dog was trying to get me, when I was like 4, whether it was, I mean, there were so many instances, right, where I just experienced these intense feelings of helplessness and panic that it may not have just been one event, right? It was probably a constellation of things in addition to experiencing emotional neglect growing up that really brought me into adulthood, struggling with a whole lot of emotional dysregulation and a broken sense of self and difficulty relating to others. And so the last thing I'll just mention is it was a little interesting going to the doctoral program in clinical psychology, because I very much was an outlier among my class as far as experience of emotional trauma. I was in this class on play therapy, and one of the things that the professors asked is for all of us to go around the room and give an example of play in our families. And it was like Norman Rockwell painting, I mean, all of these people were like, oh, and on the holidays we'd play like hide the sock, or I mean, things like that. And yeah, I mean, and that was great. I mean, good for them, good on them, right? And when it came to me, I was just like, oh, no, I know exactly what's going to happen. I know exactly what's going to happen. I am going to share my experience of my childhood and what it was like to be sitting at the dinner table while my father and my uncle were openly mocking my grandmother and laughing at her after she spent all this time making a meal. How games were about, the adults slapping the children and thinking it's funny. And it's much more like a Nightmare on Elm Street. Right. And I knew what was going to happen. And I shared, I shared my experience, and it was just like the oxygen left the room. Right. And then it was like everybody changed the way they interacted with me, changed the way they saw me. And it was just like, man, this is just such a common thing when you've experienced trauma, because it's like everybody else can share their experience, but you, because the minute that you do, it's like, people become uncomfortable and either want to mother your emotions or they just disappear, right? And so I finished my grad program, then I got into really doing a lot of couples work, and I started to notice in my couples work how like trauma triggers were emerging during conflict. And it's like, and I could see it because I could feel it. I could feel what they were. I'm like, I know exactly what's happening right now because I've been there. And I wouldn't necessarily say this, but then I started exploring much more into trauma. And it's when I came across Tim's stuff. Listening to Tim describe some of these experiences of childhood trauma, I'm like, you know what? I've known for a long time that something has been going on. And that's really when I started exploring much more about my own emotional trauma and what led me ultimately to write the book that I did. That's a little bit of a long-winded answer, but that's kind of how I got to where I am today.
Oh, it was excellent, Todd. Succinct, but very detailed, and I really appreciated it. I
Thank
think
you.
if for our listeners, if I could just say it this way, many people that go for help for the first time is because of a crisis in their adult life. So addiction, relationships are breaking down, they can't hold a job, there's no motivation, whatever. And so usually their diagnosis is, well, it's because I'm an addict. That's why if I could stop that, or it's because I don't make good decisions today. So they're looking basically at the symptoms of the crisis and trying to put band-aids on it. And then they begin to get a bit of teaching, and they go to the next level is, I had some stuff happen to me. And so then, I was sexually abused. I had a attack dog going after me. All kinds of, I was bullied at school, whatever. I wasn't a good student. And so I always felt kind of stupid. And so they look at those events, and those are all powerful shapers of your life, and they're not to be minimized or dismissed in any way. But a lot of people stop there and think that's where my trauma comes from. But what you've gone is beyond that to say, well, then there's my childhood, my upbringing in a home where there was neglect, there was abuse, there was total disrespect, there was cruel humor, all kinds of different things where my needs weren't met, where I was always made to feel not good enough, etc. And so that to me is kind of, you start with the crisis, then you go to the first level of trauma, but there's that deeper level that often you're not even aware of because you were so small, that was your normal. Everybody else seemed to be going through it, so why should it affect me? But that's where people really have to go to. And so to me, it's the journey of going to that deeper and deeper understanding of really what fed into this addiction. Yes, the sexual abuse was significant, but I'm not even sure exactly what that looked like. I don't have clear memories, but I just have a sense, but yet there's something deeper. When you were going through the addiction and that emptiness and that haunting kind of vacuum inside of you, did you go through any suicidal ideation or attempts, or did it get that dark for you at times?
All the time. I would say that once a week at least, I would want my life to end. I'm just like, I just can't wait till this is over. If this is what life is, it's not worth it. And I had a couple of attempts on my life, none of them severe enough where I ended up being hospitalized, but I did. Yeah.
The other piece to me that is so significant for the listeners to hear is many people, when they think of trauma, they think of physical events that you perceive with your five senses. And it's significant to recognize, yes, there's a physical element to most people's trauma. But regardless of that physical element, trauma at its core is how it affects you emotionally. So all trauma becomes an emotional trauma. It disrupts your psyche. It creates overwhelming emotions that come out of overwhelming events. And that's really, to me, what you've done a great job of putting into words in your book, in understanding emotional trauma. What I think for people to realize is there's an element in healing trauma where you got to do certain activities, you got to do certain actions and changes of behavior, lifestyle, thinking, etc. But if you don't do the emotional healing, the emotional work, you can think yourself to death, but you're not going to get healthy. You can go to 5 meetings a day, but that doesn't mean you're going to get healthy. That emotional intelligence. And so to me, a lot of people in the recovery world talk about dry drunks. And that's people that have sobriety, but they're emotionally still wounded and they're still acting like a 2-year-old and very emotionally immature. So can you just develop and expand kind of your journey and understanding the emotional trauma, the priority of emotional healing, what that begins to look like for people? Because that to me is what gets triggered in adult relationships. And that's then what causes people to de-escalate, act out, and then wound those that they love the most. because they get some emotional wound triggered and now they're trying to hurt everybody around them. And then relationships constantly struggle, children rebel because their parents just don't deal with that emotional wound. So back to you just to kind of develop all of that.
The way that I like to think about the emotional woundedness and the emotional trauma piece is about how does it impact my core sense of who I am. And in my book and just in my work, I've kind of identified 5 basic dimensions which are kind of tied to some existential survival needs that we have as human beings. One is we all have a need for a sense of identity, a sense of who we are, where's our place in the world, how do we fit into a system, where do we belong, where are our talents, where are our abilities, all of those kinds of things, because it helps us orient ourselves to the world around us in a way that we can think strategically and plan and build the kind of life that we would like to have. Another one is we need to have a sense of connection. Human beings by nature are relational creatures. This is why solitary confinement is so damaging to people, is that if we don't have another human being that we can resonate with, where we can emotionally attune, there's a part of our own psychological development that just doesn't happen. And if we think about well why is that? If you look at kind of the evolution of human history, it's like to be abandoned as a kid literally meant death, usually within a few hours. And so we are very, very attuned to, am I alone? Am I being rejected? Do people like me? Do people care about me? And is somebody here with me? And so that sense of connection is another one of these basic needs that we all have. Another one is a sense of value. And this has to do with, is there something that is inherent in me that other people recognize as being worthy of being valuable? Am I lovable? Do people want to spend time with me? Have some sense of meaning and some sense of value about who I am? There's also a need for a sense of agency. Right? The feeling of helplessness is incredibly distressful because when we feel helpless, then like back in the day, right, throughout history, it oftentimes meant that we were not going to live very long. If we were trapped or in a very helpless place, it's very, very much tied to our sense of survival. And the other one is we need to have a sense of, we talked about identity, just had a brain blank here, identity, sense of connection, the need for a sense of value, the need for, of course, the big one, the sense of safety. I can't believe out of all of them, when it comes to trauma, to have that one slip me. But we also have this deep need for a sense of safety, right? That we are not going to be attacked, that we are physically protected. And so during childhood, these essential needs are supposed to be met, ideally met, through our attachment relationships with our parents. So when we are distressed, we are comforted. Someone is there with us. When we feel afraid, they are there to protect us. They are there to give us a sense of identity, to say, oh, you're so smart, or you're going to be fine, you're so good at this, and to say, oh, you give us stories about our family and where we live, and we're from Nebraska or wherever, right? Because that all gives us this sense of orientation. And when those relationships that we have with our parents growing up do not meet those kind of fundamental survival needs, then it's kind of like that cup remains unfilled, and we tend to have a real sensitivity around that. We have a real sensitivity around being abandoned, or we have a real sensitivity about fear and anxiety, about feeling unsafe. We have a real anxiety around, who am I? And our whole life becomes this struggle to find a sense of place, or a sense of agency. It's like, no matter what I do, I can never seem to make anything work. I always make the wrong decisions. I'm just, there's something about me that's just broken, bad, sick, or wrong, right? And then on top of that, when you couple that with some kind of insult to the body, some kind of assault to the body, whether it is being attacked, being bullied, then there's this whole piece inside of us that lacks the resilience to be able to navigate through that without really internalizing some woundedness. An interesting thing that I learned when I was at the Sexual Violence Center in Minnesota is how a sexual assault affected the trajectory of the life of the victim, and most of them were women who came into this center, had to do with how their family reacted to it. If the family was like, you know what, we are here to support you. This was not your fault. You're an awesome person. There's nothing that you did wrong. This was on them. We are here to love you and support you and give you anything that you need. Those women, even though it was a very traumatizing experience, and there may be some still emotional triggers and flashbacks and things like that, there was the ability to heal in a way that the women whose parents were like, well, what did you do? How, how did you dress? Did you say something? I told you not to be going out at night. Well, what do you expect when you act that way or when you hang around with those people, right? Where there's further messaging around there's something inherently in here that is wrong, that is broken and is bad. Then it's like, that just creates a catastrophic amount of damage to the sense of self. That experience can become debilitating, right? An interesting story, about that came from the VA, right? Is they found that most of the soldiers that returned with significant PTSD went into the military already with a lot of adverse childhood stuff, right? So I think that, the idea that trauma is defined by an external event, I think is common, when people say, well, I didn't experience anything that bad. And it's like, well, but that's not really it. There's a whole lot of other stuff that is happening inside here based on our experiences growing up that really affect how external events are experienced emotionally and the kind of internalization of messaging that we receive from those. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's excellent. It's that emotional stuff we're taking on when those 5 needs aren't met that you talked about. And then the conclusions that the child is drawing from those 5 needs not being met, so that they develop their own messaging, the woundedness, the sensitivity to all of that, that then when something happens later, it just adds, it heaps on and like a magnifying glass blows up the messaging to even greater intensity for the person, and it's the ripple effect becomes massive. Again, I think part of our journey, part of your journey in what you do is to help people understand that trauma begins for most people not in horrific events. It begins in those 5 needs not being met, which is really almost, it's invisible. Like, well, nothing bad happened to me. So how can I have trauma? Like, well, all the kids in my neighborhood had a dad that worked 24/7 and was never home. And when he was home, he was in the same room, but wasn't emotionally available. And he was a bit angry. Like, so we just dealt with it. We had outside played with our friends all night. We never hung around Dad. So let me go back to your story, because I think to me, so what you talked about, like the girls that are sexually abused and the 2 different possible responses from families, which I think is massive. And so Peter Levine has talked about that the essence of healing trauma is being seen and heard and being able to talk about and be understood. And I agree. That's because that's what didn't happen for many. They weren't understood. They weren't allowed to talk about it without being judged, without being twisted and being made their fault somehow. So to me, what it really is that parents aren't able to be present and attuned to their children because of their own trauma, their own internal wounds. So your mom, when you said something happened and she's, well, there was a time I drove you to school and you just wouldn't get out of the car. Something kept her from actually being able to talk about. So it wasn't you wanted to talk about it, but she couldn't talk about it. So as you look back to me, what I see in your parents is they weren't able to be present and attuned to you because of their own issues. What would you say, as you've thought about it, would be kind of the wounds in your parents that kept you from being able to parent you in the way you needed at those difficult times?
I think that's a very good point. And my family has a long history of trauma and of mental health issues. On my mom's side, my great grandfather came from Sweden. And in Sweden, the Wedin family was kind of the family everybody loved at the end of the block, who had 16 kids, and everybody would come over and get cookies, or kuchen, as they would, call them in Sweden. They were just, the stories that I have heard from everybody who, from around that time, is that they were just just a joyous family in the community, kind of the one where everybody wanted to be. And my great grandfather's father wanted to come to America to start a better life. And so he came here and ended up in Ely, Minnesota, and sent back for his family. On the way here, they were on the SS Norge, which was caught in a storm and crashed into a rock called this little protruding island called Rockall in just north of Scotland, and the ship sank. And my great grandfather was 5 years old and jumped into the water, and his older brother also jumped into the water. The rest of the family tried, but were sucked down by the ship. They all died. So the mom, all of the rest of the family. And at that time, the lifeboats were trying to row away. It was very wavy and chaotic. And as my great grandfather was trying to swim toward a boat, the boat was rowing away, and they were saying that they couldn't take anybody else. And, this little 5-year-old kid, you can just imagine the panic trying to swim. It was from a wave flipping him into the boat that saved his life. And so he and his older brother, who was 13 or 14 at the time, ended up on the shores of America, and found their way. And they were able to find their way to their dad. By that time, the news of the shipwreck, which was the largest shipwreck in history prior to the Titanic, made his way to Minnesota. And then upon the news, my great grandfather's father became so depressed and started drinking, and they became an entirely broken family. And then my grandfather was his son and grew up on a farm that was so poor that my grandfather, when he was young, the family couldn't support him, so they just had him go live with another family, living in the barn as a farmhand. And my grandfather became an alcoholic, and was a very angry person when he got married and had my mom. And there were a couple of sisters, and one of them was killed in a car accident. And my grandfather became very, abusive. The family thought that, one time had to flee for their lives. And so my mom, the way that she learned how to deal with that was just to compartmentalize all of that and shut the door on it, and just like, none of this is happening, we're all okay, which is why, when I had conversations with her in adulthood, and she was always like, you were such a happy child. And I'm like, Mom, I tried to commit suicide. And she's like, don't you ever say that. Don't you ever say that to your mother, right? Because that was kind of trying to unlock that door, right? And it was so important for her. She couldn't even go to her own mother's funeral. She couldn't go to her own father's funeral, because she just could not go there. She had to maintain this sense that everything is fine. And my dad grew up in a family where there was a lot of mental illness as well. My grandfather was very, very abusive, humiliating the kids in front of their friends, physical abuse. I was physically abused by him just randomly, so we'd come home from fishing, and he'd make milkshakes, right? And we were drinking them, me and my two cousins. And I remember one time I got to the end of the glass and I slurped a little bit, and he came up and he struck me on the top of the head with his knuckle so hard I fell to the floor and just was dazed. And it's like, and that's where my dad grew up. And, my dad, he went into the field of psychology, believe it or not, and was actually quite renowned in behavioral neuroscience. Of course, he was a completely broken human being, in emotional connection, which is why he went through 3 wives. But he vowed never to hit us, so he didn't. But he himself, the only way that he could do what he did and get through life was just to completely numb himself out. And so, my mom took a job where she would leave to go to work before we got home from school, and then come home when it was bedtime because she couldn't stand being around kids. She had so much anxiety, she couldn't tolerate it. And my dad just, I think he wanted to be able to bridge that gap and be a dad, but he was so broken himself that he was just unable to do that. And one of the challenges in my own recovery was learning how to forgive them for being imperfect human beings, for being flawed human beings, right? Because there was, and it doesn't mean that I don't acknowledge the role that their own trauma played in my own life. In order for me to move forward, I had to find a way of forgiving them and having some empathy for them, while also just acknowledging as a factual reality of how I was impacted by growing up in that environment.
That is so well said. Like, 2 things to me is that most complex trauma becomes generational trauma. It gets passed on if parents don't deal with their own wounds, sadly. And secondly, one of the big pieces in recovery for most people is I got to be honest about my parents and see them accurately. That doesn't mean I'm disrespecting them. I got to see how they influence me, but somehow forgive them. But that doesn't mean I'm letting them off the hook. So you got to navigate through that and make those distinctions. But that is such a key piece. So, okay, so Andy has this Carlson Scandinavian name as well, from Minnesota as well. So he's probably just itching to ask a few questions to a fellow Scandinavian background, because I think he's feeling some parallels. So Andy, let you talk.
I find it amazing, like the level of detail that you know about your family history and my own family history. There was no storytelling, like very little communication and understanding the past. And one of the things that I've understood, there's a couple of measures of resilience. This is me going on a little bit of a tangent. Like, I've heard I've seen resilience, kind of like how resilience is given to children in a few ways. And one is the ACEs test. And so if you meet a lot of these adverse childhood experiences, then your resilience will be lower. But another one is, what are the stories that you know of your family system and the history? Because when you know these stories, great grandfather was thrown into the ocean, by a ship sinking, but survived. When you can see these difficulties, but then you go through life's hardships and then you survive, that helps like a child develop resilience too, because when you're going through a problem, you can have ideas or relate and see that you can move out of the problems. But that's my little tangent. But it was, I was taking a couple of notes as you were speaking, and I think that I've kind of push them into the categories of the 5 needs that you spoke. And so I just have a few questions, and like, I love your storytelling, but then also the transition. And so a lot of these is like, I'd love to get kind of an idea of the feel or the behavior or the patterns or the practices that help to understand or to move into this transition. And so the first one is identity. And so you talked about being a teenager, drinking alcohol and feeling normal. And then you mentioned this drive to be normal a few times. And so for people with complex trauma, we don't know who we are. We don't have this identity. We struggle. So I'll leave it really broadly. What's normal?
I think it's a myth that people with complex trauma tell themselves that everybody else has, because I think that when people are authentic, they show up in many, many different ways. And I'll speak for myself, right? I mean, I think one of my tendencies for a long, long time is I would see groups of people that tend to coalesce around common interests, and they share some, some common traits. So people that hang out at the library are different than bikers, right? And I would be among them, and then I'm like, that's kind of my image of what normal should look like. So I should try to be that. And then I would be in another context, and then it's like, there's a part of me that says, well, that must be what normal people look. Maybe I'll be like that. And what I would say about the struggle with identity is with complex trauma, at least my experience of it, I would, instead of using normal, I would use a non-traumatized brain, right? I mean, one that grew up in a semi-functional home where people have a sense of self. It's like they can adapt to different situations, but they don't become a different person in different situations, because there's that kind of a developed core of does this fit with me? Is this consistent with who I am? And if so, it's like, well, I can kind of hang out with these people, but there's parts that just don't fit with who I am. Whereas somebody who lacked that for a long time, there just wasn't that sense of having anything to compare to. Like, I see them doing this. Is this consistent with me? There would just be like a blank there. And so I think there was, for a long, long time, I would chase normal. I would, because I would see or perceive that other people had this connection and this stability and this happiness and this sense of who they were. And I so desperately longed for that I was like, well, if I can act like that, if I can try to be like that, then somehow I will feel a sense of place. I'll feel a sense of belonging. And it just never happened, right? Because I wasn't living authentically. And for me, finding that sense of identity was very difficult, actually, because when you don't have a frame of reference around which to build something, it feels like, well, where do I start? And so one of the things that I did was just look at, okay, what would I do even if I wasn't being paid? I mean, what are some things that I just love doing, and I could do them the rest of my life? And then maybe that is some indication that there's a part of me that is that identifies with that. And so I love teaching. I love talking to people. I get so excited by ideas. And so that has become a part of my identity. I haven't had anybody else tell me that. I've had to start adopting that and just acting as if that was a part of me. And over time, just kind of wearing that for a while and doing that with a bunch of things, I've started to just kind of piece together this sense of, yeah, this feels consistent. This feels right. And other times it'd be like, oh, yeah, I kind of wore this, but it just doesn't feel kind of consistent and authentic with the other parts of myself. And so the identity piece is very difficult. And I think that with people with emotional trauma, and I can speak for myself, there is a chasing of normal. There's this, I used to ask myself all the time, why can't I just be normal? Because there's this sense of like, if I was normal, then I wouldn't feel this pain. And the reality is that there's many normal. There's not really, and maybe normal isn't even the right word, maybe a stable, maybe a functional, and that can take many different shapes.
I think that actually leads me very much into my next question, which you talk about, like, so connection, and I hear in what you say and how you're speaking here, how important connection is. And you talked about earlier about this being in this place of fearing people and feeling that alienation. So not feeling that belonging necessarily. And so I was wondering if you could share, this shift from the alienation and fear to create a new understanding, or maybe a new something within that allows you to move toward that connection and towards that belonging.
I think there are few things that are as terrifying as being vulnerable to another human being. when you have been traumatized. And when I first got sober and I felt so alienated, there was a part of me that just longed to be seen. There's a part of me that just so wanted to be a part of, to be in a relationship, to experience all of those things. But I was so terrified of people that I was sober for 2 years before I could even look people in the eye. I would like look down and away, or I would look at their mouth, or, or just kind of talk like this without actually looking at them, because even looking at them felt so terrifying to me. And what I have just come to the conclusion of is, when it comes to rebuilding that sense of connection, is that this is one where we can, we just have to jump into the pool, right? You look at a kid standing at the edge of the pool, so afraid to jump in because they're like, what's going to happen if I do, and it's almost like they're locked there and they can't quite make that jump. And that is the way that I oftentimes experience, just like, what's going to happen to me if I let you into my world? If I really tell you who I am, or really tell you what I think, are you going to reject me? Are you going to hurt me? Am I putting myself in a vulnerable position where I can be hurt again? And especially since I don't even have a really good sense of me either, right? And so it's like, even have to kind of like do some exploring here with another person. And is that going to be okay? Am I safe to do that? And I think that this is one of those instances where this is just where courage has to take the day. Courage is not about being fearless, right? It's about being able to act with intent when we are afraid. It is about me physically lift, and I would do this. I would physically make myself lift my chin and look people in the eye, even though inside is like, and start to share what I was feeling and what I was thinking, even though I'm like, I am scared to death right now to do this, but I'm going to do it. And over time, what I found is that, I can swim in the deep end of the pool. It took some jumping in. It took a few mouths of water, right? And I had to cough a couple times and get out. But just by doing that and just accepting the fact that, you know what, I know I'm scared. I know it, and it is okay. It is okay to be scared. I don't have to wait till that's gone before I start taking some intentional actions to reach out and start to make some connections with people. And so for me, it was just having some courage and just taking baby steps and doing little things to start building that connection that then gave that kind of was the opening that allowed that to continue to grow.
So what happens with so many people so let's say they realize they don't have connection, and then they take a course and they get all these academic tools about you need to connect, etc. And this sounds great. This is wonderful. This is my problem. I'm going to connect. And without realizing it, they kind of assume or think it's going to be just implement these tools. It'll be easy. And then I'll have this connection. What they don't realize is between getting the tools and experiencing the benefits, they got to walk through a ton of fear, because every step you do to get healthy triggers a fear. Then I'm going to be abandoned, rejected, etc. And so it's like, this isn't as simple as I thought. This is the scariest thing I've ever done in my life. But what I want people to realize is, to get healthy, you got to walk through fear. Being healthy triggers fear. And so if you don't accept that that's going to be part of the journey, and you're going to need to figure out tools to manage that fear, to have courage to get past that fear, to still do the right thing in the face of fear, you'll never get to the benefits of all that information. So you've said that again so well, but thank you for that. Okay, Andy, back to you.
Yeah. I like where both of you kind of brought it, because that, putting that connection is that ability to be vulnerable to another. And then the moving into that courage, I think like a lot of us with complex trauma is we want to move forward, but with this ideal of the absence of pain or the absence of problem. And so, being at the edge of the pool, but knowing you're going to gulp water. Like you have a choice. You're never going to get off of that edge, or you're going to gulp water. Like that that there is going to be this discomfort and this pain and this fear that you have to travel through. So with connection, I want to move a little bit into value, your sense of value. And, you talked about the performance, kind of being in that performer mode, which is the external validation.
One of the most powerful effects of a healthy emotional attachment is an internalized sense that I'm a lovable human being. And when we don't get that, and a lot of this has to do with particularly when we experience shaming through our parents, there's this internalized sense that there's something that's just wrong and unlovable about me. There's just some fundamental element of myself that is unlikable, that people don't like. And even though I may be completely competent in business, I can get anything done. I can communicate great. I can lead teams. Behind the scenes, there can still be this sense of, and I feel like who I am at the core is just unlovable. So I can keep everybody out here. I can be charismatic and perform, and everybody loves me and thinks that I'm super great. And there can be some truth to that. We may have all those talents, right? And I mean, two things can be simultaneously true, right? I mean, that we really do have these abilities, but may also carry this internalized sense that once people really get to know me, once they really know the truth of who I am, they're going to realize that I am an unlovable or dislikable person. And there's one of the things that I push back a little bit on in kind of the marketplace of ideas that are out there is that somehow we can give that to ourselves in like standing in front of a mirror and saying, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me, right? When in reality, that's just not how it works. When it comes to value, we have to experience being valued in order for that to feel real. If somebody tells us, dude, you're like the coolest person in the world and everybody loves you. If you don't have that internalized sense of self, that'll feel like, well, thanks. But, if you really knew who I was in the interior, you'd know that that's just not true. Right? You may be gracious and say, thank you, I appreciate it. But it would, those kind of compliments could almost feel uncomfortable to get because it feels so inconsistent with how we see ourselves. And that, this is one of the reasons why, even more powerfully than being in therapy is being in a relationship where somebody can treat you as a valuable and lovable person. And you experience being in that relationship where it's like, wow, they don't mind going out of their way to be there for me or to do something for me, even if it means a little bit of inconvenience on their part. They'll gladly do it. That sends me a message that I'm valued. There's something about me that is lovable. Or when they think I'm funny and they say things like, man, I'm so glad that I know you, and I'm so glad that you're in my life. Then it's like those messages hit our deep sense of core self differently than if we go through an intellectual exercise of writing down on a piece of paper. It's like, well, I can do this well, so because the intellectual piece just doesn't hit us in the same way that experiential piece does. And so, when it comes to internalizing that sense of value, one of the things I do a lot with my couples work is get them to start building that in each other, because we just know that while affirmations can be helpful and give us some warm fuzzies in the moment, they're not enough to really change the interior. The only other piece that I would say to that is that we also, when we have a wounded sense of self, one of the things that is affected is our perception of ourselves and the environment. Right? It impacts how we perceive things, right? This becomes a lens through which we interpret things. And so we can choose how we're going to interpret something. Like when somebody sends us a card, we can choose that we didn't expect, and we can just choose to interpret that and to use that as evidence of, what, somebody finds value in me, somebody appreciates me. And if we make that kind of acknowledgement, instead of just dismissing it as, oh well, I got a card, that was nice, but actively tell ourselves that was something that they did because they see some value in me. That is something that we can do separate from just the relational stuff to help kind of fill that cup of that need for a sense of value.
I agree wholeheartedly with the place to help a person begin to have a sense of internal inherent value is connection, that somebody values them. But I think that has the potential of being misunderstood in our culture today, because a lot of people think, oh, okay, I'll connect with you and I'll just give you affirmations. I'll tell you how wonderful you are. And so to me, it's what is connection that actually communicates value, and it's somebody that's fully present. And so it's so many children with complex trauma have had a parent who's been 75% present, but 25% they're looking at the mail, they're looking at their phone, their mind's wandering, and the child feels something's more important than me. So I'm still don't have that sense of value unless the parent is 100% present. And so it's the ability, whether I say anything or not, to be 100% present to a person that really says, you mean more to me now than anything else in my life, and I'm giving you number one priority. So the second thing I just wanted to comment on is reason why we're getting into these questions is, if you look at connection, if you look at sense of value, to me, those are the absolute foundation of building blocks of a healthy life. If you don't have connection, if you don't have value, then the house is built on an angle. The house is going to fall apart. It's just not solid construction. But if those get damaged early in life, and you build your house on a faulty foundation without the right ingredients, you don't rebuild it in a day. And that's really what you're helping people see, Todd, is to rebuild a sense of connection and to rebuild a sense of value doesn't happen overnight. There's 1,000 little baby steps and 1,000 fears that have to be confronted, and new tools that have to be learned, and things you force yourself to do that you naturally resist doing, that are all part of this slowly healing, growing, learning package. So again, it's just, I think everybody still sadly is in the mindset that there's got to be a quick fix somewhere with all of this. If I could just find the right YouTube guru that's going to give me a quick fix. And there's lots that are advertising it, but it's false advertising. Just kind of give people a sense of just how long and how up and down and how complicated this journey's been for you to build pieces that really you didn't get a good start on as a child.
The first thing I want to mention is the 100% presence is so key. Somebody just being fully present with you, even if they don't have any words of wisdom, even if they don't have like this little quip that will suddenly make, unlock the future for you, just literally being present with you in your experience is absolutely a huge component of that value piece. And I'm glad that you brought that up. I think one of the myths, just kind of like the myth of normal, I think there's also a myth of arriving that we oftentimes have when we have complex trauma, because we're like, well, we see other people's highlight reels and it's like, well, they've arrived, I just want to get there. And when you're in this business, you see that, well, a lot of people struggle, even people without trauma struggle, and everything is an evolution, and everything is about, in my mind, it's like, how can I build momentum going in a particular direction? And how do I measure success by the process of evolution rather than some arbitrary, gee, wouldn't it be great if I was like that sort of thing? Because these images that I think we create for ourselves when we're in such a place of discomfort and suffering, There's just such a desire to be like, oh my God, can I just be happy? Can I just have a successful family? Can I just have a successful career? Can I just be in a place where I don't feel bad? Right. And so what we tend to do is measure, create this arbitrary endpoint, and then measure where we feel we're at against this kind of this arbitrary endpoint that may or may not even exist. Right. And oftentimes then we go, God, I'm not there. None of this works. I'm not making any progress. Even if we'd made great progress, it still feels like such a huge gap that we can become discouraged. And so what I had to do for myself, and this is something that I tell people I work with, is like, take the little wins, right? It's like, if today I reacted differently to my coworker than I did previously, acknowledge, just take a moment, pause, and just say, that's a win. I have evolved. Because if we can recognize and make baby steps and take those as wins, then what we do is we start building momentum. And then it's like, then it feels like we're starting to move in the right direction. And if we focus on success as a process of evolution, rather than some imaginary endpoint when the world is full of rainbows and unicorns, right? And we're always smiling and everything is so great. Not only do I think that is a healthier approach, but I think it's a more objectively real approach, because you're dealing with what is real. You're dealing with recognizing real accomplishment, real growth. And if we focus on the little wins, then our experience of life is that we feel ourselves being propelled forward in a positive direction in life, rather than we are still short of where we want to be. And those two self messages are very different. One is very defeatist and will undermine our own ability to recognize our progress, and will in a lot of instances self-sabotage us. And the other one is recognizing the reality of the situation of like, you know what? Yeah, I've got some stuff that I have to overcome. It doesn't mean that I'm bad, sick, or wrong, or that I'm a terrible human being. It doesn't mean that there's anything inherently wrong with me. I have a normal brain that went through some extraordinary circumstances, and in order to get through that, I've had to adopt some means of coping that are just not serving me well. And if I can just acknowledge that and just look at just taking the next little right step, and then acknowledging that and celebrating that win, then over time, I will look back and realize how much I have changed, and how much I have grown, and how much better I feel. Even though in the moment, we may be we may be struggling. If we just pay attention to the little wins and look at success as a process of evolution rather than an endpoint, I think that makes all the difference in the world in how we experience our recovery.
Yeah, I think that was like a really beautiful expression of moving from kind of that achievement oriented to a process oriented mindset. And the way you explain it, you could really see this, it's almost this practice of scarcity that we do when we create a goal in the future and just compare ourselves, judge ourselves against it all the time, versus stepping into this action, the small actions that we can do. Earlier when you were talking about sexual violence, sexual assault, and a lot of people in trauma in general, when you have maybe like a freeze response through your childhood trauma or through something, your agency's been stripped away. But also often there's this like looking back where you kind of self-condemn of, I should have done something, I shouldn't have. You talked about the two different families of how they treat each other, but there's also that internal condemnation that some people do. How would you speak to somebody who's in that place of self-condemnation and maybe unaware that they've had a freeze response, and kind of like, how would you talk somebody through that or walk somebody through that just to maybe have a more compassionate view of themselves that moves them to rebuilding and recognizing their agency as well?
That's an excellent point. One of my mantras is that clarity is power, right? The more that we can have a clear understanding of just what is happening, the better we are able to make sense out of our experience and move forward in a productive way. One of the things that is so difficult about complex trauma and trauma in general is that it leads to this lack of sense of clarity. It's like it becomes difficult to differentiate between what is real and what is not real and what just feels real, right? And the reason why I bring up the clarity thing is that when I talk to people who have experienced emotional trauma, and this is something I had to come to the realization myself, is that trauma tends to occur when there are two conditions that happen simultaneously. When we have some kind of perceived extreme threat to our well-being, coupled with being trapped. I talk about a common thing that I talk about when I give a talk is imagine that you're in a house fire. And all of a sudden you wake up at 2 a.m. and the smoke alarms are going off. There's smoke in the room and you're like, oh my God, we got to get out of the house. And, it's like you gather the cat and your computer, get the kids and the other people, and you get out in the front lawn and you call the fire department and you see the fire going and it's tragic. And there's a sense of loss. There's a lot of, it's disrupting to your life for sure, but it's a different experience than if, oh my God, the house is on fire and we can't get out. Then the brain goes to a very different place. And that's when that fight or flight response can completely take over how you respond in that situation. And that freeze response, that panic response happens when that part of our brain just completely floods our ability to act with intent. And now all of a sudden we are literally frozen. It is not something that we can choose. But what's important to understand is that instead of looking back and saying, oh my God, I should have socked him in the nose. I should have said, get out of my house, right? Or whatever. It's like understanding that is where your brain goes when it's in that situation where you feel a severe threat to your well-being and you feel trapped, is that your brain will respond with that freeze response. Others may experience the flight response. Others may experience, a fight response where they're like, I don't care if I die, I'm fighting you, and even they are not making that decision to do that. It is being made by these areas in the brainstem, right? This kind of reptilian fight or flight response just shuts down our ability to think with intent. And now all of a sudden we are just acting in a very deep survival mode. And it's just like what possums do, right? They go into a freeze response. And that is one of the responses that the brain has. And if you go into that mode, it doesn't mean that you did anything wrong. It means that was the strategy your brain was employing at the time in order to survive. Had you fought back, you may be dead right now. And so I think it's important to take a very radically non-judgmental approach to how emotions get triggered and show up. Because especially that fight or flight response, part of our brain just pushes us out of the driver's seat completely and takes over and is like, I don't care where you want to go, we're going this way, right? As a way of helping us survive. And the bigger question about developing a sense of agency, and I found this with myself and most of the people that I work with, there are oftentimes dimensions of a person's sense of agency that tend to be affected by some kind of emotional trauma. It's not that I don't have any agency in anything. I may be a great computer programmer, right? But when it comes to making a decision about where to go for dinner, it's almost like now all of a sudden my brain just goes into this amorphous cloud-like state where it's like I can't even form a coherent thought, or this sense of like, well, just apply for that job. Or if you're unhappy at work, apply for another job. And then we go into this place where it's like, that almost feels so overwhelming that it's not like I'm afraid to, but I have no frame of reference to even how to navigate through that. Even though I may be extremely competent and have a good sense of agency in these other areas of my life, I may be a CEO of a company, but when it comes to, having a sense of agency in how to deal with my kids, all of a sudden it's just like that disappears. And so I think when it comes to a sense of agency, many times where we lack the sense of agency is within the domain where we experience some trauma. And just like with the building of a sense of value, looking at ways of where can I just get a small win. And it's like, right now trying to pick out a place for dinner just feels overwhelming. And I'm actually experiencing a little bit of panic and don't even know what to do. And just coming up with a plan of how to navigate through that, right? And just saying, let's just go to McDonald's, or let's just go to, to the restaurant down the street. And the last thing that I'll say to that, and this is kind of related, I hope this is helpful. One of the things that I always tell my clients whenever I'm particularly in couples is I talk about having a fire drill and, fire escape plan. And I talk about how the time to make a fire escape plan from a building is not when it's on fire, right? You do it during calm times when there's no crisis. And essentially what you're doing is, if this happens, right, and we're all of a sudden like the conflict is escalating or whatever, what is our plan for getting out of that? And this is also something that I use when people have this sense of helplessness. And it's like, okay, do you feel helpless right now? And it's like, well, no. It's like, okay, then right now is the good time to make the fire escape plan. When you recognize, can you recognize when all of a sudden that little tweak happens and your emotions shift and you're just like in that place where you go into that freeze response or you feel helpless? Can we come up with just a step that you can take when those things happen? Because most of the time, if people have a kind of a preset, break the glass, pull this piece of paper out and follow the instructions, figuratively, right? Then if they can do something, then oftentimes they can kind of continue that. But, that has been a helpful way for myself and with my clients to help navigate through that and start overcoming that sense of helplessness that comes from that damaged sense of agency, if that makes sense.
I like that. I think that's such an important point, to be able to have that prepare, plan, practice when you're not in that, either that helpless or aroused state. And I'm noticing too, I think there's like one of your general themes, which I appreciate, is there's this kind of taking these monolithic words and the goals and moving everything into what's one step, one small step, one actionable step, just making it very kind of tiny, gentle and real, but also doable to start to build, as you said earlier, that momentum. And so I want to kind of go to your fifth point, and just thinking about safety, and from the lens, your story about your family, like, I think it was very clearly explained, where you can see this pattern of generational trauma, and recognizing that a lot of complex trauma is traumatized people traumatizing others through maybe their own lack of skills or their lack of safety or an inability to communicate. And so now, being here in this point, being surrounded by family and possibly friends who come from their own complex trauma, their own generational trauma, how do you begin to find and cultivate safety? What do some of those initial steps look like?
That's a big question. So a couple things that before getting into some of the specifics, because some of the things that I think are important to understand about safety is that feeling safe is the prerequisite to feeling present, right? If we don't feel safe being embodied, if we don't feel safe where we are, we'll tend to do one of two things, right? We tend to go into a bit of a dissociative state, right? Where either our sense of identity and all of that stuff just kind of evaporates, right? Where we just kind of lose that sense of who we are. or we go into some form of that fight or flight response, right? Where we either become combative because we feel like we need to protect ourselves, and that's what anger is, right? I mean, anger is a way of setting and holding a boundary when it feels like that is being violated in some way. And so the sense of safety is absolutely critical. And one of the real challenges in people that have experienced trauma is that we lose the ability to recognize safe situations and safe people, and recognize warning signs when things and situations and people are not safe. Um, and the finding that sense of safety is critical, but is so important in order to be fully embodied and fully present and to heal. But at the same time, when we struggle with this sense of how do I know I can trust, it seems like every time I get into a relationship or I think that there's somebody who is trustworthy, I end up getting wounded again. And so now it's like I don't feel like I can trust anybody, which is, it's kind of a difficult situation because we need other people in order to heal, right? In order to feel valued and all of those kinds of things. But the one thing that I would say about safety is that for me, I started with a list of behaviors that I was willing to accept and a list of behaviors that I was just unwilling to accept. And one of them, for example, if somebody says, like, I am completely unwilling to accept people being sarcastic towards me. The minute they do that, I'm gone. I've just decided this is one of my fire escape plans, right? Is like, if you're going to be, say things like, oh God, your hair looks stupid, or something like that, I'm like, I'm done. Because that the implications of those kind of comments, even though there's a part of us that goes, ha ha ha, boy, aren't you funny? There's another deeper part of us that cannot differentiate what's real and what's not real. They can't differentiate between fact and fantasy. That's why we can cry in a movie, right? We know old Yeller wasn't really shot, right? Or Bambi's mom really didn't die, but our emotions respond as though they are because they're, that deeper emotional part can't differentiate what's true and what's not. But when it comes to a sense of safety, what I just started to do is just created a list of these are the criteria that I'm willing to accept, and these are the criteria that I'm unwilling to accept. When I see somebody being mean to somebody else or being callous to somebody else, I'm not going to have them in my life. When I see somebody not tip a waiter, that to me tells me something about their level of compassion, their level of generosity, their level of all of that, of kindness. And it's like, it sounds kind of callous, but when you don't have a good internalized sense of how to select good people from bad people, right? I mean, you got to start somewhere, right? And so for me, that's how I started, is just to create a sense of, or just a list of what are criteria of a good person. And those are the people that I am going to I'm going to let into my life. And one of the challenges that I found, and I think that this is true with a lot of, at least the folks that I've worked with, is that we tend to be in groups of people that somehow resonate with our woundedness. And so, kind of shifting our focus into, being around people that are, kind of healthier, safer, more supportive, all of that can oftentimes feel like awkward and like we don't really belong, like we're posers, like imposter syndrome kind of stuff. Like, these aren't the people that I really feel like I resonate with, right? Because they're healthy, right? And I always tell people, just expect that, right? When you start getting around healthier people, expect that there will be a part of you that feels like I'm not worthy, I'm not enough, if they really know who I was. Because what will oftentimes you'll find is, if you're really around a kind person and you share with them some of your woundedness, they will be like, Thank you so much for your trust in me, for sharing that. That was really amazing. And I have a lot more respect for you for being vulnerable like that and sharing that with me. A toxic person, or a person that is less supportive would be like, wow, sounds like you need some therapy. Or it'll be like, you think you got problems? Listen to me. And so I think that that sense of safety is absolutely critical, and not only physical safety but emotional safety. It has to be safe to be me. I have to feel safe to be vulnerable, to be open, and that you will be here with me and you will acknowledge me. But the initial making a list of what you'll accept, I think, is a good place to start. But then it's going to evolve over time as you grow. Right. And as I grow, my intuitive sense of who are the good people evolves, where I didn't have a good sense of that later. Today, I feel like I have a much better sense of that. And so I tend to surround myself with people who are very safe.
Just wanted to share, it's a little bit humorous in a way, but I remember early on when I was working with clients and realizing that they really didn't have a sense of creating their own sense of what's safe or not, who's a safe person or not. So I would go to a big whiteboard in the classroom and I would just red flags of unsafe people and manipulate, disrespect, lie. And they would fill the board up like with over 50 to 100 characteristics of red flags. And they go, wow, okay, I see it. And then they'd go, problem is I see a lot of it in myself too, that I do the very things that make me unsafe. So I got to get saved. But then I go, okay, how many of you, now that you see, you got all written down, here's the list of criteria of what makes an unsafe person. How many can see all of that and you're still going to go out and develop a relationship and go against all of your red flags? And the whole class would put their hands up and I go, why? Because I long to be loved. And that trumps everything in my mind. Once I feel somebody's going to love me, I don't care about the red flags anymore. And so that led to that deeper, again, issue. So often our unhealed wounds cause us not to be able to follow good advice. And we end up hurting ourselves. And then to me, the second thing is most people with complex trauma have shut down their intuition or their gut because they sensed danger, but they were forced to go into it. They were judged for pointing out, I don't feel comfortable with Uncle Joe there. And so they just shut it down. And so that's why they now walk into lack of safety because their gut radar isn't working. And so it's, how do you revive a system that's been shut down for so many years? And I think what you're saying is, well, you begin by, what does that system look for? Well, it looks for honesty. It looks for respect. It looks for, okay, I'm going to start. And then gradually you reawaken that intuition and you get better and better at being able to listen to your body, listen to your gut.
I have one more question before we kind of maybe move into wrapping up. And so I'm just thinking, given everything that you've shared today and who you've evolved into and grown to, if you're back in a room where they're asking that play question and, everybody's got their Norman Rockwell and what you're going to say is going to turn people off, turn them into their fixing mode. You're different. Who is Todd in that room?
I would still share the same thing, but I would understand their reaction in a much different way. Back in the day, I just saw that as further evidence of how unlovable I was, how different I was, and how alienated I was from everybody else. And today, I wouldn't perceive it that way. I would see their reaction as them having some challenge in being present with somebody who had experienced emotional trauma. And rather than seeing it as a deficit in myself, see it as an opportunity for them to learn more about the experience of trauma and how they can develop their own ability to be present with people who have experienced emotional trauma.
I love that. Just creating this opportunity for others to learn more. It's really beautiful. And before we wrap up here, I'll just carte blanche hand it over to you. If there's anything you'd like to leave our listeners with, any final message, something that you wish people healing from emotional trauma could feel and believe, what would you like to share with people?
I think an important message for people to understand is that recovering from emotional trauma is not about kind of getting over the trauma, so to speak. Because none of us can just get over our experiences in life, whether they're positive or negative. They're all a part of our story. They're all a part of who we are. Recovery is about recognizing how some of those events and some of our emotional reactions are creating some difficulty in our life today. And just being able to look at them objectively without judgment, without seeing them as a flaw, but rather seeing them as just the natural consequences of the events that we've had to go through. Recovering from emotional trauma is really more about how do I learn how to navigate through life in a happier, positive, more functional way, given that I have this history of stuff that has happened, and that because of that, there will probably always be some sensitivity around feeling abandoned, or there may be some sensitivity around feeling like I'm unworthy or feeling alone. And knowing that, having some clarity around where that comes from and having some tools to navigate through those things a little bit differently is kind of like putting a little warning cone in the potholes in a road, where instead of just driving along straight and hitting these things and being jumbled about by them, we learn how to navigate around them and to navigate through those experiences in a way that still allows us to enjoy the life and become the person that we were meant to be. So I think that momentum, it's all about momentum. It's all about recognizing the small wins and allowing ourselves to evolve without putting this added pressure of being done or being fixed or any of those things. Because I think that those are arbitrary pressures that we put on ourselves that I think are just not grounded in reality, nor are they helpful.
Thanks for sharing that. And where can people find you and your book? Where can people find you online?
My website is drtodd.com, just drtodd.com. I was fortunate enough to buy that domain back in the 1990s when you could still get domains like that. But yeah, if you go to drtodd.com, that's my website, it has pretty much everything on there. My book, Recovering from Emotional Trauma, is listed on Amazon, or you can buy it off my website. And I also have a podcast. And so I would invite anybody to come out to my site and take a look at my work. And that's where they can find me.
Dr. Todd, thank you for being with us here today, for your warmth, your insightful storytelling, your clarity. And for everyone listening, just to remember that emotional trauma doesn't mean that you're broken. It means your system adapted to survive. So healing's about reclaiming these parts of you that were left behind. And Todd shared with us today a lot of good navigation advice to work with our needs of our identity, connection, value, agency, and safety. And really, I think with like that awareness, compassion, and a slow intent, you can take one step at a time. So Dr. Todd, thank you again. And everyone listening, we're grateful you spent this time with us. We'll see you next time on Time with Tim. Thank you for joining us on the Time with Tim podcast. If you'd like to share your own experiences or have questions, feel free to email us at podcasts@timfletcher.ca. Want to learn more about complex trauma? Subscribe to Tim Fletcher's YouTube channel for past lectures and his Friday night Tim Talks. You can also connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and TikTok. Looking for more support? We offer programs and courses to help with healing complex trauma and recovering from addictions. Visit timfletcher.ca to learn more or send us an inquiry. We're here to support you. Until we meet again, take care and thank you for letting us be a part of your healing journey.